Ladies and gentlemen, Jeffrey McAvoy here. Welcome back to part 2 of reconditioning a Carter AFB carburetor. Now, first of all, I checked the throttle spindle play, which is very important because this can be a source of air leaks, which is quite annoying. It could alter the fuel metering and render the setting of the carburetor quite impossible. So it's a very important thing to check. In this case, it's in very, very good condition, which is wonderful. And then lubricate the spindles with some very light oil. This oil, in fact, is mainly destined for sewing machines. So it's very, very light oil indeed. It's perfect for this kind of application. Now, the idle adjusting screws are next to go back into the carburetor. Again, a very tiny drop of oil to lubricate the threads, and then I just managed to seat them by hand very gently. And if you remember, in the previous video I measured the number of turns that these screws were out, and this is the resetting of that exact value. So as a rule of thumb, 2.5 turns usually works to achieve the basic setting on some idle screws. It's a value that you find on many different carburetors, and this one is no exception. From there on, it's just a matter of laying out all the gaskets that you will find in the pack and discard the useless ones, which apply to different variations of the AFB carburetor. Next step is to simply refit the primary, secondary ventures, the jets, etc., and just put everything back. Next up is refitting the plunger assembly. Now, I decided to measure the springs of this plunger assembly just out of pure curiosity, and the new one was slightly longer. It's a good idea always to compare new versus old parts, and you can clearly see in this case that the plunger itself is slightly longer, the new one. So you can also tell that the old one still does some sort of action, but the new one kind of just drops uselessly into the bore. So the course of action to remedy this is to let it soak in petrol. I actually let this one soak overnight, and we will be refitting that in a moment. Now, next up is the needle and seat assemblies with the two floats as well. You can definitely tell that the float movement is not at all the same on both sides of the carburetor, so this will alter the fueling on one side or the other, so that is obviously no good. The float level are out of spec, and the float drop is out of spec as well. So now is a good time to whip out the adjustment data table, because obviously you cannot know by heart every single setting for every single variation of carburetor. Yeah, there are so many different variations possible that it's really a good idea to check out that adjustment data table. So first start by setting the float. So comparing the adjustment data table, it's 5.55 millimeters, and you have to hold the air horn upside down and measure the distance in between the edges of the floats and the gasket surface on the outer end. Now, the adjustment is carried out by carefully bending the float brackets and making sure that the floats are aligned, obviously, because you don't want them to foul on the bowl. So it's a good idea to take the float off its spindle, because you don't want to exert any pressure on the needle valve, which would damage it. So yeah, it is this setting is one of the most tedious ones, because you really have to go bit by bit to get it within spec. So you have to, each time remove the float, bend the little tab, then reset it, remeasure, and so on and so forth until you're satisfied on both sides. So once you're happy with that, it's time to measure the float drop. Here you can definitely see that it's out of spec as well, and you have to hold the air horn upright and as level as you can, and adjust the dimension that is listed in the adjustment data table. In this case, you have to bend the float stop tabs on the float bracket. So again, you have to remove the float every time, and it's again a tedious operation. You don't want to go too wild on this, because you could break the tab off if you're really too brutal with it. So you really need to go bit by bit. Anyway, that's the way I do it. And just, you know, measure, set your calipers and measure, and then take the float off, reset, and so on and so forth again until you are entirely satisfied. Now you have to get the two sides right. It's very important to do so, because otherwise the fuel metering will be affected. You know, it's the float bowls who contain a certain quantity of petrol. If the quantity varies from one side to the other, you risk having either too much petrol arriving to one bank of cylinders, or not enough in another case. So once you have adjusted the float drop, it's a good idea to check the adjustment of the float setting again, just to make absolutely 100% sure that it's all good. Once you are happy with that, you can move to put the needles back with the little retaining spring onto the float bracket, which, you know, helps the movement of the needle as the float goes. So it's a good idea to fit these. They weren't on the carburetor when I dismantled it, but they do have them now. Once you're happy with that, it's time to take the plunger out of its bath and check its fitment. Now, as I said, I left this soak in petrol overnight, which is very nice. And now just testing the fitment, it does fit properly. And the way that this works is that when you accelerate, it will push a certain quantity through the pump jet housing, which was highlighted in red just now, into the primary venturi, and give it a good squirt of petrol when you most need it, like when you're flooring it. Next up is the step-up rods and the little vacuum pistons and their springs. A light coat of oil does help as well. Here's a quick way of showing how it works. So there's a little hole, actually carries some vacuum in it, and will, depending on the circumstances, retract or no the step-up rods from the jets that are contained at the bottom of the bowl. Now it's very difficult to refit the air horn. I noticed that by shaking it very lightly, it makes things easier to center the step-up rods into their jets. And next is just a matter of screwing the air horn back to the carburetor body itself, and in a crisscross pattern, as I usually do when you have multiple screws on this. This ensures that the gasket seats evenly, and that the pressure exerted by the screws is also evenly applied to the part. First, you have to definitely make sure that you didn't forget to put the return spring, like I did here at this point. So yeah, I had to take off the air horn and reset it. Now again, with the adjustment data table, check the pump adjustment value. And so to carry out this part, you have to back out the throttle stop screw until the primary throttle valve seat in the bores, and measure the distance from the top of the pump plunger rod to the air horn, and that should be as listed as in the adjustment data table. Now you can alter this value by slightly bending the rod with a pair of pliers very carefully, and again, you know, measure and bend and measure again and measure and rebend until you get the exact value. Next up is adjusting the fast idle screw, again using the adjustment data value, which is pretty straightforward. Another adjustment that needs to be done is the choke piston linkage. So this is very fine as well, and it's the same method of attaining the proper tuning data. You just have to remove the rod and bend it accordingly. Next up, you have to refit the thermostatic coil assembly and its housing as per the setting that we identified upon dismantling. Now, it probably will need some further adjusting on the car itself. It depends. We'll figure that out later on. Refit the fuel inlet gaze. Lastly, adjusting the fast idle linkage. There are 3 different applications in this case. It's just a matter of getting the index aligned with the spindle. Now, to complete the fast idle linkage adjustment, you have to hold the choke lever closed, making sure that the 2 levers on the end of the choke shaft are in contact with each other. And while you hold all these parts together, you just simply adjust the fast idle screw with the index mark on the fast idle cam and comparing values with the adjustment data table. That's pretty much it. From there on, you just have to refit the gasket to the inlet manifold, drop the carb back on, and job is done pretty much. You need to refit the linkage and bolt it down and so on and so forth. And that's pretty much it. So that was very tedious, but it was good fun. We'll be setting that carburetor at some point with the engine running. It's going to be great fun as well. Thank you so very much for watching. I highly appreciate it. Make sure you drop a like, leave a comment, and I'll be catching you all in the next video.